What's up, pagan people? Drew here, and this is another edition of my Witchy Tale series. I apologize, but for this video I kind of have to give some backstory so that you have context, so that you will actually understand the way the events that inspired this tale unfolded. Otherwise, it genuinely will not make sense to you what happened and why it happened. Obviously, I call this particular witchy tale Dueling Grandparents. So the story involves my grandparents, and I'm sorry if it is at all boring or uninteresting, but it is necessary, so please bear with me. Okay, so my paternal grandmother was born and raised in the Midwest, and this story, where it starts, will have taken place in the mid to late 40s, when she was probably between the ages of 18 and 20. I'm honestly not sure. Maybe even as young as 17. I don't know, honestly. My grandmother was Native American, and her family were not treated well at all. As a matter of fact, I am under the impression that she was 3/4, that her father was full-blooded Native American and her mother was half. And her father wanted all of his children to pass for white because of the way he had been treated. On top of that, they were poor. I am talking dirt poor. In those days, you could farm your children out, which means you would send them to work on someone else's farm, and the parents would be paid for their labor. Not paid much, and a lot of abuses of all kinds occurred in those situations. Happened to her in later generations, but that's not part of the story. So around the time, again, sometime between, she was probably 18, 19, 20, somewhere in there, she had a run-in with a young man from the area she lived in. And when I say she had a run-in, I mean she was raped. And the problem being, this young man was from a Scottish family that was very rich and influential in that area. And she felt to her core, whether she was right or not, she probably was, but she felt that it would not do any good to tell anyone because they weren't going to believe her. And even if they did, they weren't going to care because she was nobody. She was a minority that they didn't care about, and had no standing in the community. And this other family was the exact opposite. So she didn't tell anyone. And a short time later, this young man came back to her and told her he wanted her to marry him. And if she refused, he would rape her younger sister. So she married him. Okay? Let me give you a little bit more insight into the man that is my grandfather. Fast forward a little bit, not much. They're married and living together, and they have their first child. This is my father. One morning, when my father was in very early infancy, maybe a month, 2 months, 3 months at most, my grandmother was standing in the kitchen at the stove cooking her husband breakfast. And my father began to squawk because he was hungry. And my grandfather said, "Shut that kid up." And my grandmother turned her head slightly and said, "I will, just let me finish this." And continued. She didn't want to burn his breakfast. Almost immediately, he stood up and walked over to the cot that the baby was in, picked my father up, and threw him against the wall. Let's fast forward a little bit more. At this point, they have 3 children together. My grandmother has left my grandfather. She's staying with family. He finds her, pulls up in the driveway in his truck and gets out. And my grandmother is standing on the front porch with a shotgun pointed at him. Picture this, okay? This woman was 5'1" and 90 pounds soaking wet all of her life. So she's standing on the front porch with a shotgun pointed at her husband. I don't really know exactly how the conversation went down, but I do know she was telling him to leave. And he was saying whatever he was saying. Now, on one side of my grandmother is, and I believe, I've always envisioned it as the left side. I guess it doesn't matter. But on one side of my grandmother stands my father, who at the time is 7. On the other side stands his brother, who was 6. And behind her is their 4-year-old little sister. My father is standing, and he will not take his eyes off his father. And he's saying one phrase over and over and over again to my grandmother. Shoot him. Shoot him. Shoot him. Shoot him. Shoot him. Over and over and over again. Because this is how terrified of this man these people were. These children were. My grandfather was a horrible person. I never met him. Never saw him. This was the last time they had interaction with him. After this, at some point, my grandmother remarried and had tons more babies. When I was 18, she came to live with us. And by the end of it, it was like 2 years she lived with us. There was no love lost between us. We absolutely despised each other, did not like each other at all, for various reasons. She may have felt that I was spoiled, but I think the main reason she didn't like me is that I didn't like her. Like, I just didn't get along with her. She was not a nice person toward girls. It's a long story and a whole other, it's not relevant to the witchy tale. My grandmother died a few years after she stopped living with us. And as for my grandfather, I believe he died in the 80s. I'm not sure. He decided to go hunting one day, and he went camping out in the woods. And when he didn't turn up after a couple weeks, they went looking for him. The cops found his tent and his insulin inside his tent. And so the story, the official story, is that he wandered off into the woods and was either too drunk, passed out, couldn't make it back, or got lost, or got hurt, and couldn't make it back to his tent to his insulin because he was an extreme diabetic. He was severe and really needed his insulin. And so they think that he went into a diabetic coma and died. No body was ever found. Nobody knows what really happened to this man. So now let's get to the witchy tale. All right. During the time that this occurred, I was staying with my parents, and they had a 2-story home, and we had the upstairs for our family, and they had the downstairs. At the entrance where the stairway led into the upstairs, there was a baby gate. And I had a rule set in place in the upstairs of the home. The downstairs was whatever. But in the upstairs of the home, after my children went to bed, no one was allowed in our space unless they were angels or our guides. Otherwise, you're not invited. Don't come in. It is not allowed, definitely. And for the most part, that rule was followed. But one night I was dead asleep. And suddenly it was like, it was the weirdest thing. Someone stood over me and had been drinking whiskey and breathed intentionally into my face. And so my eyes snapped open, and I immediately recognized that it was whiskey because back in the day when I was young, Jack Daniels was my poison. So I immediately recognized that smell. And not that it was Jack Daniels, but it was definitely whiskey. I sat up, looking around the room. There, obviously there's nothing there. I don't know what's happening really. I'm half asleep. I'm groggy. So I'm like, well, I have to pee. So I got up out of the bed and I walked down the hall. Now, my bedroom was at the end of the hall. And as I come out of the bedroom, take a few steps, and there's the stairway with the baby gate. Take a few more steps over to the left, the other side, it's the bathroom door. And then if I continued down the hallway, I'd get to my kids' room. As I stepped into the bathroom doorway and flipped on the light, suddenly I had this my third eye took over, my inner sight took over, and I didn't see the bathroom with my physical eyes at all. All I could see was the hallway behind me in my mind's eye, and a man was walking down the hallway past me, and as he passed me, I saw that the back of his head was blown out, and my reaction surprised me, honestly. I was just like, really? You had to show, like, that's gross. Like, I didn't need to see that in the middle of the night when I'm trying to go to the bathroom, jerk. And I just like kept going in the bathroom and used the restroom, and on my way back out, I paused in the doorway again, because this time there was what I would call a shadow person. There was a silhouette, a very deep black silhouette, standing on the other side of the baby gate. This energy, entity, spirit, what have you, was not coming into my space. It was following the rules. But I immediately recognized the energy of this individual as my grandmother. And my reaction was, what the hell are you doing here? Because, like I said, we did not get along. And I immediately felt this shift and understood that she was not happy about the dude walking around in the house. Did not want him there. Felt the need to be there to protect the family from this individual. And that sparked the idea of, oh, maybe that was my grandfather. I honestly can't see any other reason why she would have come. But I went back to bed, and I don't remember honestly if it was the next day. It probably was, though. My mother has always been my source of information about my family. It doesn't matter what side we're talking about, whether it's her side of the family or my father's side of the family. She's the one who would ask uncomfortable questions and dig around and get information. So she was like the information holder for both sides of the family. Nobody else really talked about that kind of stuff very much. So I immediately went to my mother and asked her what she thought. I explained to her exactly what happened. And the first thing out of my mother's mouth was that my grandfather was an alcoholic and that he drank whiskey. And the second thing, her immediate response was, I wouldn't be surprised at all if somebody took that motherfucker out in the woods and blew his head off. Everybody hated him. He was a terrible, nasty person. I know that was my grandmother. I feel very strongly that that was my grandfather. I have no idea why he would come to see us. When he was coming down the hall, he was coming from my children's room. He had been in my room and then apparently went to the kids' room. I don't know if he was just checking in, if he was curious, if there was some sort of possessive nastiness. I don't know. It's actually not the only time I've had an interaction with him. We'll get to that later. That's for another witchy tale. Maybe he just wanted somebody to know the truth about how he died. Whatever that is. I honestly don't know. But that's my experience of dueling grandparents. I wonder if any of you have had any experiences with loved ones who have crossed over. I have a couple more, but those will be for later witchy tales as well. Of course, I am so grateful that you guys came and hung out with me and listened to me jabber on. Thanks for listening, guys. And until next time, much love and gratitude.